December 20, 1944, Bastogne, Belgium. The forest is silent under fresh snow. Foxholes cut into frozen ground ring the town in a rough circle. Inside them, men of the 101st Airborne Division sit wrapped in thin coats, boots stiff with ice, rifles pressed close for warmth. Breath hangs in the air. Frostbite spreads quietly from fingers to wrist. They are surrounded. German artillery lands methodically. Shells crack in the earth and tearing through trees already stripped bare by winter. Roads leading out of Bastogne are sealed. Supply columns cannot get through. Wounded men lie in aid stations with little morphine and no plasma. Ammunition is counted carefully, round by round, on German maps. The situation is clear. The Americans are cut off, outnumbered, cold, and should already be finished. German officers study reports and aerial photographs in disbelief. Every expectation says the resistance should have collapsed days ago. No air support, no armor, no relief in sight, yet the perimeter holds. Each attack is met by rifle fire, machine guns, and stubborn refusal. The town does not fall. The lines do not break. In the frozen forest around Bastogne, something is happening that German command did not plan for. The surrounded are not retreating. They are digging in. The situation at Bastogne did not emerge by accident. It was the result of a calculated gamble, one that German leadership believed could still change the course of the war. In December 1944, Adolf Hitler launched Unternehmen Wacht am Rhein, the Ardennes offensive. The objective was ambitious and desperate. German forces would strike through the Ardennes forest, split the Allied armies, cross the Meuse River, and seize Antwerp. If successful, the offensive would cripple Allied logistics and force a negotiated peace in the West. The timing was deliberate. Winter weather grounded Allied aircraft. Snow and fog limited visibility. American units in the Ardennes sector were lightly deployed, many of them inexperienced or resting after earlier campaigns. German commanders believed surprise and momentum could compensate for dwindling fuel, manpower shortages, and material inferiority. At the center of this plan lay Bastogne. Bastogne was not a large town, but it was strategically vital. 7 major roads converged there. Whoever controlled Bastogne controlled movement through the southern Ardennes. Fuel, armor, infantry, and artillery all depended on those routes. Without Bastogne, the German advance would choke. The initial assault achieved tactical surprise. On December 16th, German forces smashed into American lines. Infantry divisions and armored spearheads pushed forward rapidly. Several U.S. units were overwhelmed or forced back. Confusion spread. Communications failed. Entire sections of the front bent under pressure. By December 18th, German columns were racing westward. American command reacted urgently. Units were redirected in mid-movement. Orders changed hourly. One formation in particular was rushed toward the crisis, the 101st Airborne Division. They were not prepared for prolonged combat. They lacked winter clothing. Many had no experience fighting together in this configuration, but they were available and Bastogne could not be abandoned. The 101st moved by truck through snow and darkness, arriving piecemeal on December 18th and 19th. There was no time to establish elaborate defenses. Foxholes were scraped into frozen ground. Roadblocks were thrown together using whatever materials were available. Heavy weapons were positioned quickly, often without full coordination. By December 20th, German armor had closed the ring. Bastogne was encircled. German commanders viewed the situation as temporary. They expected the Americans to withdraw or surrender once the reality of encirclement set in. History supported this assumption. Surrounded units, especially without supplier relief, rarely held out long. But Bastogne did not behave like previous engagements despite shortages, cold, and mounting casualties. The American perimeter held. Attacks were repelled with discipline and improvisation. Roadblocks slowed armor. Infantry assaults were broken up by interlocking fields of fire. German officers monitoring the advance began to notice something troubling. The offensive was slowing. The timetable assumed Bastogne would fall quickly. Instead, it remained a stubborn obstacle, forcing German forces to divert strength and time they could not afford. And as days passed, the question became unavoidable. Why had the surrounded not collapsed? The answer lay not in luck or accident, but in what the defenders were prepared to endure and how they were led. For the men of the 101st Airborne, Bastogne was never meant to be a fortress. They arrived without preparation for winter warfare. Many paratroopers wore light jump jackets instead of cold weather coats. Gloves were scarce. Boots froze solid overnight. Medical supplies were dangerously low. Ammunition, particularly artillery shells, was rationed carefully from the first day. Yet the division had one advantage the German planners underestimated: experience under pressure. The 101st was not a typical infantry formation. Its soldiers were trained to operate isolated, scattered, and without immediate support. From Normandy to Holland, airborne units had learned to fight surrounded not by holding neat lines, but by forming flexible pockets of resistance that could shift as needed. At Bastogne, that doctrine mattered. The defensive perimeter was wide and uneven. stretching several miles around the town. Instead of rigid positions, companies and platoons occupied villages, forest, road junctions, and ridgelines. If one sector came under heavy attack, nearby units adjusted fire and movement. When German armor probed a weak point, paratroopers fell back deliberately, then counterattacked once the advance slowed. Leadership played a decisive role. Brigadier General Anthony McAuliffe, acting division commander, maintained a calm, direct command style. Orders were short. Expectations were clear. Company commanders and non-commissioned officers were trusted to make decisions on the ground, without waiting for permission. That trust kept the defense alive. Communications were unreliable. Radios failed. Phone lines were cut. Snow and shell fire isolated positions for hours at a time. Under normal circumstances, this would have caused confusion and panic. At Bastogne, it produced initiative. Junior leaders filled gaps. Machine gun teams repositioned themselves. Anti-tank crews waited until German armor was dangerously close before firing, conserving scarce ammunition. The Germans expected collapse once supplies ran low. Instead, resistance hardened. Paratroopers shared ammunition. Wounded men stayed in foxholes longer than doctors recommended. Soldiers rotated positions informally to keep one another awake in the cold. The lack of reinforcements removed any illusion of rescue and paradoxically strengthened resolve. There was nowhere else to go. German officers observing the situation struggled to understand this behavior. Their experience suggested that surrounded units eventually broke under pressure, especially when deprived of supply and artillery support. Bastogne defied that model. Every hour the town held disrupted the German timetable. Armored units were forced to detour. Infantry divisions were tied down. Fuel burned while vehicles sat idle outside the perimeter. The offensive depended on speed. Bastogne destroyed that speed. By December 21st, German command recognized the problem. The Americans were not withdrawing. They were not disintegrating. They were holding ground that should have been untenable. The encirclement had failed to produce the expected result, and as frustration mounted, German commanders prepared a move they believed would finally end the resistance. A demand for surrender. What followed would become one of the defining moments of the campaign. Angle 1. Human angle. Endurance in the cold defense of Bastogne was not sustained by firepower alone. It was sustained by bodies pushed past their limits. Temperatures fell well below freezing. Snow-soaked clothing that never properly dried. Frostbite crept into hands and feet, often unnoticed until numbness became pain. Sleep came in minutes, not hours, and was interrupted constantly by shell fire. Many paratroopers had not eaten a hot meal in days. Medical stations were overwhelmed. Surgeons worked with limited light and supplies, performing amputations and emergency procedures under artillery fire. Plasma was rationed. Morphine ran out. Wounded men often refused evacuation to avoid weakening the line, yet morale did not collapse. Men joked quietly in foxholes. They shared cigarettes, ammunition, and scraps of food. Letters from home were read aloud when possible. Small routines cleaning weapons, checking positions created order amid chaos. The knowledge that everyone was equally exposed mattered. There were no safe rear areas. Officers froze alongside enlisted men. Command posts were shelled like any other position. The shared hardship removed distance between ranks. For German officers accustomed to units breaking under less severe conditions, this behavior was incomprehensible. The Americans were not rotating out. They were not requesting surrender terms. They were simply enduring. That endurance became contagious. Each night survived reinforced the next day's resistance. The cold that was meant to weaken instead hardened resolve. The men did not believe relief was imminent, but they believed holding was necessary, and so they did. Angle 2. Tactical angle. Defense without a Lineth defense of Bastogne did not resemble traditional trench warfare. There was no continuous front line. Instead, the 101st established a defensive perimeter, a fluid ring of positions anchored on key terrain. Road junctions, villages, wooded high ground, and open fields were occupied not for symbolic value, but for control of movement. This flexibility confused German attackers. When armor advanced, it encountered roadblocks supported by bazookas and artillery fire called in at close range. When infantry pushed through forests, they ran into interlocking machine gun fields. If pressure became overwhelming, American units withdrew short distances, then counterattacked once German formations overextended. Artillery, though limited in ammunition, was used with precision. Forward observers risked exposure to call fire dangerously close to friendly positions. The goal was not massed barrages, but disruption, breaking up attacks before they could gain momentum. German officers expected the Americans to cling rigidly to positions. Instead, they found defenders who shifted constantly, denying clear targets. Each probe required coordination, time, and fuel resources the German offensive could not spare. The perimeter bent. It did not break. Every failed attack cost Germany time. And time, not casualties, became the critical factor. Angle 3. Psychological angle. The power of no retreat encirclement is meant to break morale. At Bastogne, it did the opposite. Once the paratroopers understood there would be no withdrawal, no immediate relief, and no resupply, a psychological shift occurred. The ambiguity of choice vanished. There was only one task: hold. This clarity mattered. Fear did not disappear, but it became focused. Soldiers stopped asking when they would leave. They began planning how to survive the next hour, the next attack, the next night. Small victories repelling a patrol, destroying a tank took on enormous significance. German psychological warfare efforts failed. Loudspeakers, leaflets, and probing attacks were meant to signal inevitability. Instead, they reinforced the sense that the enemy needed surrender. To avoid further delay, the Americans did not interpret encirclement as isolation. They interpreted it as commitment. German officers watching the situation began to realize something unsettling. The longer the perimeter held, the stronger it became, not in material terms, but in resolve. The surrounded force was no longer waiting to be defeated. It had decided not to be. Angle for leadership. Angle, trust under fiery Bastogne. Leadership did not announce itself through speeches or dramatic gestures. It revealed itself through restraint. Brigadier General Anthony McAuliffe, serving as acting commander of the 101st Airborne, understood the situation with clarity. The division was surrounded. Supplies were short. Relief was uncertain. Panic would be fatal. So he removed uncertainty wherever he could. Orders were brief and direct. Units were told to hold key ground and adapt as necessary. Company commanders were trusted to make decisions without constant oversight. Non-commissioned officers were empowered to shift positions, redistribute ammunition, and respond to sudden threats. This decentralization mattered. Communications were unreliable. Shellfire cut line. Radios failed in the cold. A rigid command structure would have collapsed under these conditions. Instead, initiative filled the gaps. Junior leaders acted based on intent rather than instruction. McAuliffe's calm tone filtered downward. There were no unrealistic promises, no false optimism. The message was simple: the division would hold until relieved. Nothing more was required. German officers later noted this absence of confusion. Attacks encountered coordinated resistance even when American positions appeared fragmented. Counterattacks came quickly. Defensive fires were disciplined. Leadership at Bastogne was not about control. It was about confidence. That subordinates would act correctly when left alone in the cold and dark, and they did. Angle 5. Enemy angle. German miscalculations ran. Officers believed they understood encirclement. In their experience, surrounded units broke down through exhaustion, supply shortages, and psychological pressure. Bastogne was expected to follow that pattern. The Americans were lightly equipped, rushed into position, and cut off. The expectation of collapse shaped German planning. Instead of overwhelming the perimeter immediately, German units probed, pressured, and waited. They assumed time would do the work. Each day the Americans remained surrounded was expected to weaken them further. That assumption proved costly. German attacks lacked urgency. Armor was diverted to other routes. Infantry assaults were piecemeal rather than decisive. When resistance stiffened, commanders hesitated, expecting surrender to follow naturally. It did not. As days passed, German officers grew frustrated. Reports contradicted expectations. The Americans were not conserving strength for surrender. They were counterattacking. They were repairing defenses. They were resisting with intensity disproportionate to their situation. The realization came slowly, reluctantly. The encirclement had not broken the defenders. It had fixed them in place. By the time German command recognized the error, momentum was already slipping away. Angle 6. Moral angle. Why this should have failed. From a purely military standpoint, the defense of Bastogne should not have succeeded. Surrounded forces typically face predictable problems. Supplies run out. Casualties accumulate. Morale deteriorates. Command and control breaks down. Eventually, resistance becomes symbolic rather than effective. At Bastogne, those conditions existed. What failed was the assumption that hardship alone determines outcome. The 101st Airborne did not hold because conditions were favorable. They held because discipline, training, and leadership compensated for what they lacked. Shared hardship replaced dependency on supply. Trust replaced rigid control. This unsettled German officers who believed morale could be mathematically reduced through isolation. They were wrong. Defense demonstrated that morale is not simply a function of comfort or numbers. It is shaped by purpose, cohesion, and belief in one's role. The paratroopers believed their stand mattered. That belief outlasted hunger and cold. Encirclement was meant to remove options. Instead, it clarified them, and once clarity replaced fear, surrender was no longer inevitable. By December 22, 1944, German commanders concluded that time alone would not end the resistance at Bastogne. The Americans were still holding. The roads were still blocked, and the offensive timetable was slipping. German artillery intensified its fire. Infantry probed more aggressively. Armored units maneuvered for pressure points. Yet every attack met coordinated resistance. The perimeter bent, but it did not collapse. That morning, German command made a decision grounded in logic rather than force. They would demand surrender. A white flag was raised. German officers approached the American lines under truce, carrying a formal message addressed to the commander of the surrounded forces. The tone was confident, almost courteous. It outlined the American situation in clear terms: encircled, outnumbered, cut off from supply and support, continued resistance. The message warned would result in complete destruction for German officers. This was procedure. In previous campaigns, similar ultimatums had worked. Surrounded units often accepted reality when faced with overwhelming odds. Bastogne, on paper, fit every condition for surrender. The German envoys were escorted through American lines to headquarters. They passed wounded soldiers being treated in makeshift aid stations. They saw paratroopers moving between foxholes, weapons ready, positions intact. There was no sign of collapse. Inside the headquarters, Brigadier General Anthony McAuliffe read the message. The situation it described was accurate. Supplies were low. Casualties were mounting. The division was surrounded, yet the conclusion did not follow. McAuliffe did not convene a long discussion. He did not ask for terms. He did not attempt negotiation. The message did not introduce new information. It merely restated what everyone already knew. The staff debated briefly how to respond. The Germans expected formality, perhaps a written refusal, something acknowledging the severity of the situation. What emerged instead was unexpected. McAuliffe dictated a short reply so brief that his staff initially questioned whether it was sufficient. It was translated and delivered back to the German officers. The message contained a single word: nuts. It was not intended as humor. It was not bravado. It was an expression of finality. In plain terms, it meant refusal complete and unconditional. German officers were confused. They asked for clarification. American officers explained calmly. The meaning was unmistakable. There would be no surrender. The Americans intended to hold. The envoys returned to their lines carrying a message that defied expectation. This was the turning point. The surrender demand had been designed to end resistance without further cost. Instead, it revealed something German command had misjudged from the beginning. The Americans did not view their situation as hopeless. They viewed it as fixed. By refusing surrender, the 101st Airborne transformed encirclement from a pressure tactic into a commitment. The Germans now faced a choice of their own: commit resources they could not spare, or accept continued delay. Neither option favored them. The ultimatum had failed not because the Americans were unaware of reality, but because they had already accepted it. And acceptance, once reached, is harder to break than optimism. The German officers returned to their headquarters carrying more than a refusal. They carried certainty. There would be no collapse from within Bastogne, no negotiated end, no quiet opening of the gates. The Americans had made their position unmistakable. They would not surrender, not today, not tomorrow, not under pressure for German command. This changed everything. The surrender demand had been a test. If it succeeded, Bastogne could be cleared without committing scarce fuel, artillery ammunition, and infantry strength. If it failed, the town would have to be taken by force or bypassed at great risk. The reply ended the debate. German artillery resumed its bombardment with renewed intensity. Infantry assaults followed, probing the perimeter village by village. Tanks attempted to break through roadblocks, only to be ambushed at close range by bazooka teams. And artillery fire directed from forward observers operating dangerously close to the front. The fighting grew more violent, but the result remained the same. American positions absorbed the pressure and held. The refusal to surrender had a psychological effect far beyond the wire. Among the paratroopers, it spread quickly. The message required no explanation. It confirmed what most already believed: holding was the mission, and it would continue regardless of circumstance. Morale did not surge dramatically. It stabilized. That mattered more. Men stopped wondering if surrender was being considered somewhere above them. The question was settled. Every action from that point forward carried clarity of purpose. Ammunition was conserved with discipline. Positions were reinforced with urgency. Counterattacks were executed aggressively to keep German units off balance. German officers, meanwhile, grew increasingly frustrated. Each failed assault consumed time and fuel. Armored units burned precious reserves idling outside the perimeter. Infantry suffered casualties for limited gains. The offensive timetable already strained slipped further. Weather began to shift. Cloud cover thinned. Snowstorms broke intermittently. Allied aircraft, grounded for days, began to appear in the skies. Supplies were dropped into Bastogne by parachute. Ammunition, medical kits, and food reached the defenders at last. The encirclement had not tightened in time. The window for forcing surrender closed. German command now faced a strategic dilemma. To continue attacking Bastogne meant diverting forces needed elsewhere. To bypass it meant leaving a hostile strongpoint astride vital roads, threatening lines of communication. They attempted both and succeeded at neither. On December 26, American armored units from General Patton's Third Army broke through German lines and reached the outskirts of Bastogne. The siege was not fully lifted immediately, but the encirclement was broken. The moment passed quietly. There was no dramatic celebration. The defenders were exhausted. Many were wounded. Others were barely standing from cold and fatigue. But the fact was undeniable. They had held. German officers reviewing the situation afterwards struggled to reconcile expectation with outcome. Every indicator had suggested surrender was inevitable. Yet the surrounded force had not only resisted, it had disrupted the entire offensive. The turning point at Bastogne was not a single battle or maneuver. It was a decision to refuse the logic of encirclement and replace it with resolve. Once that decision was made, every German calculation based on collapse became irrelevant. The offensive lost its momentum not when tanks were destroyed, but when time was lost. Bastogne had consumed more time than Germany could afford. From that moment on, the outcome of the Ardennes offensive was no longer in doubt. What followed was consequence. The immediate consequences of Bastogne's defense became clear within days. The German offensive had been built on speed. Armored columns were meant to surge westward, seize bridges, and outrun Allied responses. Bastogne was supposed to fall quickly, clearing the road network for continued advance. Instead, it became an anchor that dragged the entire operation off schedule. German units assigned to the Ardennes offensive were forced into repeated assaults against a position that refused to break. Tanks burned fuel without advancing. Infantry suffered losses in forest fighting that produced no decisive gains. Artillery ammunition was expended against well-dug positions that absorbed punishment and held. Time slipped away. Every hour spent outside Bastogne was an hour not spent driving toward the Meuse. Every division tied down around the town was a division unavailable elsewhere. The offensive timetable already tight collapsed under the weight of delay. American commanders recognized the opportunity immediately. While the 101st Airborne held the perimeter, Allied forces regrouped. Reinforcements moved into position. Supply lines stabilized. Units that had been surprised during the initial German attack regained cohesion and confidence. The weather shift that followed was decisive. As cloud cover broke intermittently after December 23rd, Allied aircraft returned to the skies. Transport planes dropped supplies directly into Bastogne, easing shortages that had threatened the defenders. Fighter bombers attacked German positions and supply lines, compounding the pressure already felt by the attackers. For the German troops surrounding Bastogne, the situation deteriorated rapidly. Fuel shortages worsened. Ammunition ran low. Casualties mounted. The expectation of a swift victory gave way to frustration and exhaustion. Units were ordered to continue attacks despite diminishing returns, draining morale and combat effectiveness. Inside Bastogne, the effect was the opposite. Relief, even partial, validated the decision to hold. Supplies restored operational capability. Medical treatment improved. Ammunition shortages eased. The defenders did not suddenly become comfortable, but they became sustainable. When Patton's Third Army finally broke through on December 26, the psychological impact was immediate. The encirclement was no longer complete. German forces now faced the prospect of being attacked from multiple directions while still failing to secure their original objectives. The defense of Bastogne had achieved more than survival. It had bought time. That time allowed Allied command to regain initiative. German momentum, the critical factor of the offensive, was gone. The Ardennes attack, once envisioned as a decisive blow, became a costly gamble spiraling out of control. German officers reviewing the situation understood the implication clearly. Bastogne had not been a sideshow. It had been a fulcrum. By holding the crossroads, the 101st Airborne had disrupted the operational logic of the entire campaign. The offensive would continue for weeks, but its outcome was already decided. Bastogne had turned surprise into stalemate, and stalemate, under the weight of Allied resources, could only end one way. As the weeks passed, the broader consequences of Bastogne's stand became fully visible across the Western Front. The Ardennes offensive had been Germany's last major gamble. It consumed reserves that could not be replaced: fuel, experienced troops, armored vehicles, and artillery ammunition. Bastogne's resistance did not merely delay the attack. It accelerated German exhaustion at the exact moment when endurance mattered most. Units pulled back from the perimeter around Bastogne were weakened. Tanks required fuel that no longer existed. Infantry formations were understrength and fatigued. The losses suffered in repeated, fruitless assaults could not be recovered. Germany's ability to conduct large-scale offensive operations in the West effectively ended in the forest of Belgium. For the Allies, the outcome was transformative. The successful defense of Bastogne became a rallying point. It restored confidence shaken by the initial surprise of the German attack. Commanders saw proof that disciplined defense could absorb even a well-planned offensive. Soldiers across the front understood that the enemy's momentum had limits and that those limits could be enforced. The 101st Airborne emerged from the siege battered but intact. Casualty lists were heavy. Frostbite claimed almost as many men as enemy fire. Many soldiers required evacuation for wounds and exposure. Yet the division remained operational. It had not disintegrated. It had not surrendered. It had fulfilled its mission under conditions that historically produced collapse. German officers, in post-war analysis, repeatedly returned to Bastogne as a point of failure. They acknowledged that expectations of surrender had shaped their decisions. They underestimated the American capacity for decentralized resistance. They misjudged the effect of leadership and morale under encirclement. Most critically, they failed to account for how quickly time would become their enemy. Bastogne was not defeated by firepower. It was defeated by patience. By refusing to collapse. The defenders forced Germany to spend resources it did not have. Every hour the town held shifted the balance further toward a light dominant. When the offensive finally stalled completely, it did so not at the Meuse, but far short of its objectives, broken by a series of delays. With Bastogne at their center. In the long view of the war, Bastogne stands as a case study in operational denial. The 101st Airborne did not win by counterattacking outward. They won by refusing to give ground inward. They denied the enemy what it needed most: time and freedom of movement. When the war ended months later, Bastogne was remembered not only as a heroic defense, but as a turning point that revealed a deeper truth. Germany no longer had the margin for error, and Bastogne ensured there would be no margin left. The defense of Bastogne is often remembered as an act of defiance, a surrounded division refusing to surrender against overwhelming odds. But beneath the legend lies a quieter, more enduring lesson about how wars are actually decided. The 101st Airborne did not hold Bastogne because they were better armed. They were not. They did not hold because conditions favored them. They did not. They held because discipline, trust, and clarity replaced uncertainty at the moment when uncertainty should have broken them. Encirclement is meant to remove choice. At Bastogne, it did something different. It simplified the mission. There would be no retreat, no negotiation, no waiting for ideal conditions. There was only holding ground until holding was no longer required. German officers believed the logic of war was on their side. The Americans were cold, undersupplied, and surrounded. History suggested surrender was inevitable. What history failed to measure was cohesion, the invisible force that turns endurance into resistance. Leadership mattered. Orders were clear. Authority was decentralized. Junior leaders acted without hesitation. Each foxhole became a position of responsibility rather than fear. The men did not wait to be rescued. They accepted that rescue might not come. That acceptance changed everything. By holding Bastogne, the 101st Airborne did not simply disrupt a German offensive. They exposed its fragility. The Ardennes attack depended on speed, surprise, and momentum. Bastogne denied all three. Time was consumed. Fuel was burned. Confidence eroded. When the offensive failed, it was not because German soldiers lacked courage. It failed because the system behind them could not sustain delay. Bastogne forced that delay. The lesson endures beyond the winter of 1944. Wars are not decided only by strength or numbers. They are decided by which side can endure pressure without losing purpose. Which side can hold when logic says they should fall. At Bastogne, the surrounded held. And in doing so, they revealed the moment when Germany's last gamble became its last mistake. The war did not end there, but the outcome was no longer in doubt.